So joining me on the podcast this morning is Professor Justine Nolan, Director of the Australian Human Rights Institute. Justine, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Sam. Great to be here.
I want to start this conversation just by setting out the framework of what's currently there, because we're a liberal democracy that doesn't have a Bill of Rights or any sort of document with this kind of title like a Human Rights Act. How are human rights protected by law right now?
So we're the only Western liberal democracy without a Human Rights Act. And at the moment we have sort of a patchwork system of rights protection. There's a few rights in the Constitution, but our Constitution is nothing like, the American or the French Constitution, which is eloquent on rights. Some rights are sort of protected by common law, which is judge-made law. And then there's sort of some implied rights. So it's this patchwork of system, and there's a very limited number of rights and not really what you'd consider human rights that are protected at the moment.
And has that made it hard to enforce human rights in court cases?
Yeah, so you get this gap. I mean, Australia does some things very well. So we have extensive legislation on discrimination law, lots of different types of discrimination law. But when you fall outside those boundaries, then victims just simply don't have pathways or obvious pathways around human rights. So there are massive gaps, and enforcement has long been a problem in Australia.
But something I always think about is that there are these big international documents, and these big international documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Australia is a signatory to that. Does that not kind of fill that gap? So
there's major human rights treaties, and Australia is, signed those and ratified those, or bound by them. But what you happen in the system is that you have international law, but for it to work in Australia and for it to be, for us to sort of use it as a pathway for remedy, then you've got to turn that into law. So, for example, international law. So discrimination law, we've taken parts of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and made extensive discrimination laws around that, around sex, age, disability. But there's a whole suite of other rights, and particularly economic and social rights like social security, housing, food, water, which we have never translated into national law. So all of those international laws guide us and provide us with a framework, but in terms of enforcement, they mean little in Australia.
And I guess what you're talking about there is if you're somebody impacted by one of those areas that you just rattled off, how do you actually go about being remedied, being fixed in that area?
Yeah, there's no clear pathway. And so, what we have in the system in Australia is largely some rights, but without responsibility.
Right.
There's no responsibility, there's no accountability. And then that totally makes these rights illegitimate because they can't be enforced.
Can you, before we get to the potential solution that we're going to discuss, can you just give me an example of one of these areas that you think would really benefit from its own law?
So, for example, housing rights. It's a massive issue in Australia at the moment, particularly around cost of living crisis, where we're seeing evictions rise. So there's sporadic laws around Australia. They differ from state to state. There's no national laws on housing, no national standards. And, largely at the moment, eviction laws tend to favour the landlord and not those who are most vulnerable. And so that's a situation where there are international, rights around it, and it sets out criteria about what housing rights should look like in terms of accessibility and culturally appropriate and all of these types of things. But Australia doesn't have anything like that.
And so then last week, a parliamentary committee proposed the government establish Australia's first ever human rights law, the Human Rights Act. What would that actually look like?
So the idea, and this is really historic, what this parliamentary committee is proposing, is the idea is that there is a Human Rights Act that would apply to all Australians, everybody who is here, citizens and non-citizens, everybody within Australia. And when you boil it down to, what it basically means is that what we're agreeing to do is protect people's and respect people's basic dignity. And then we do that through recognising their right to free speech, their right to housing, their right to social security. And we have standards that are national, that everybody applies to everybody. And we're also setting up a pathway where if things go wrong, and they do, we know we've had multiple royal commissions which show this in the last few years, then those people have a pathway to seeking remedy.
So that sounds pretty straightforward to me.
Yeah.
Like it kind of sounds like it would make sense that you'd put all of that. It seems like we've agreed to it at an international level. Why are we then the only Western democracy to have not done this into law, and why has it taken so long?
Hello, I'm James and I produced the video you're watching. If you're enjoying what you're watching, we'd love it if you considered subscribing and checking us out on our other platforms. It'd really help in getting the word out about what we're doing here at TDA. Thanks very much, and now back to the deep dive.
Well, that's a really good question. And I think it's sometimes when you hear great ideas and people are like, Yeah, don't we already have that? For many years, Australians would think about, human rights, but they're probably just people overseas that need them, not us. Everything is fine here. And people in Australia now think, well, actually, I have rights that need to be respected, and when something goes wrong, I need to be able to, get remedied in relation to that.
So I can tell from your answers that you're in favour of a Human Rights Act and that you kind of want to see it happening. What criticism or commentary have you heard in the discussions you've been having about the Act that could perhaps be the other side of the coin?
Sure. So the most obvious one is that we don't need it. Australia is a liberal democracy. People are in a great place. Everything is working. There are a number of rights. There are a number of laws that we have that we can, pursue in relation to problems. But then I would say, well, if I look at just the last few years, we've had a Royal Commission into robo-debt, into aged care and disability, which have just been startling in terms of the impacts on people. People's lives have been destroyed. And you see the abuses that people are suffering. And so logically you say, well, then the system we have isn't working. We need something else. It's not that it's nothing there, but we need to plug the gaps and we need to have a holistic framework. So we've got 3 states that have already had them for a number of years, and that argument just has not been seen through. Right. There's been consistent, clauses that have pushed under it, but in no stretch of an imagination has sort of been floodgates in relation to human rights claims.
It seems to me that a really important part of this discussion is the PR effect of a Human Rights Act and the ability for it to bring human rights into the consciousness of everybody when it's part of an act. Do you agree that that's a significant part of things, the kind of public perception of human rights? Yeah,
so you say PR, I would say culture. Like a sort of what we're starting to...
And that's the difference between you and me.
Yeah, not media trained. I think what it is starting to bring into Australia that Australia recognise it needs, and clearly the majority of people want, is a rights culture where, human rights sometimes can be scary to people because they feel like, what is that? We're giving special rights to people. At its essence, what it boils down to is that we recognise that everybody has inherent dignity, and we're going to find ways to respect that and respect, their fundamental freedoms around that. So I think it's really important, the point you raised, that we start to... We're a mature democracy, that we have that conversation, and that we recognise that as a culture, this is where we're moving, and we're joining everybody else on the global stage.
2 more questions from me. From here, where do you see this policy discussion going? Like, what does the roadmap look like?
So this is a report from a parliamentary committee on human rights, which is recommending this historic change. Now we await the government response. So ideally then we have the government coming in and saying, yes, this is what we do, and then we set a pathway out for reform. The Australian Human Rights Commission has been doing work for a number of years, setting out a pathway of what that would look like. There's a whole coalition of civil society organisations looking at the Charter of Rights movement. So I think what we'll see is policy and advocacy discussions, and we will wait a government response that will then provide a framework for what happens next.
Final question. So you were actually my law professor.
I was.
At the University of New South Wales. You now do work with the Australian Human Rights Institute. This is just part of the human rights landscape in Australia. What's the biggest challenge facing the human rights sector in Australia? Like, what do we need? Does it need more funding? Does it need more literacy? Where are you seeing the biggest opportunity for us to really make a move?
Both of those things, I think. With funding comes resources that enhances your capacity to send a message out. But I think the biggest thing is that question that we just had at the moment, this acceptance of that human rights are relevant and needed in Australia. And I really do think that we are there now. And, if you look at how the world is exploding around us and discussions in Australia around many issues, whether it's around Indigenous issues, racism, housing rights, the cost of living, all of these are going to be more mature discussions, more accessible discussions when you put them in a rights framework and you respect people to have those thoughts, to have those opinions. And the idea of a Human Rights Act is that it's really a preventative measure as well, that you start to embed in people this notion that we need this and we have this literacy. So I do think sort of literacy and education is a huge part of human rights in Australia. And if you want to give us money, please send it.
Professor Justine Nolan from the Australian Human Rights Institute, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sam.